This is the New Revolution, Element 3, Part 3. Now, don't worry, it's not as bad as it sounds. This video isn't very long, but we do want to address one major revolution during this time that was very different from the revolutions that had come before it in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, even into the 1970s. See, all of those revolutions were considered to be very liberal movements, very left-wing movements. Well, after a time period of just general apathy in the 1970s, another major revolution took place that was exactly the polar opposite of what had happened in the 1960s. It was called the Conservative Revolution of the 1980s, and it was led by this guy, President Ronald Reagan, who'd been president from 1981 to 1989. Now, this is also known as the rise of the quote-unquote new right, or the reemergence of the right wing, if you will, because the 1960s, well, a lot of groups had referred to themselves there as the new left, or the new emergence of the left wing at that time. The 60s being more left wing and liberal, and the 1980s being more right wing and conservative. The new right was a direct response to the new left of the 1960s. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means exactly what it sounds like. The 1980s was very conservative, not only in the economic beliefs of Ronald Reagan, as you can see here. Remember Reaganomics when we studied that before? It was the idea of very low taxes, very limited social programs, ultra-capitalistic, as you can see by the quote here. But it was also about being politically conservative as well. Ronald Reagan was a Republican, elected in 1980 and 1984, and he was followed by his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, elected in 1988, president from 1989 to 1993, and father of George W. Bush, who would be president himself 7 years after George H.W. Bush left the presidency. But this lesson is about the social reforms of the time, and those were decidedly conservative as well. As much as Ronald Reagan was the face of the conservative revolution of the 1980s and was backed up by the presidency of George H.W. Bush, the 1980s was just as much about this guy, Jerry Falwell, who promoted Christian values through his organization known as the Moral Majority. Now, the Moral Majority was really big in the 1980s in terms of pushing conservative social reforms, much different than the decades that had come before. This meant huge TV evangelism shows and basically countering any really liberal social efforts that had taken place before, including same-sex couples and things along those lines. But even beyond Reagan, Bush, or the evangelist Jerry Falwell, the 1980s, politically, economically, and socially, was about one thing: burying the liberalism that had taken place in the 1960s and early 1970s. If you take a look at this political cartoon here, you'll see a series of elephant pallbearers. The elephant is the symbol of the conservative Republican Party. And the conservative revolution of the 1980s basically did what it set out to do in this political cartoon: bury the liberal ideas of the new left from the 1960s and replace them with the conservative values of the new right in the 1980s. That meant reversing many 1960s government policies and also reversing a lot of the court decisions made by Chief Justice Earl Warren back in the 1960s and supported by Chief Justice Warren Burger after Warren left the court. Bottom line is that the 1980s conservative revolution was just that: a new revolution, this time of conservative values, as opposed to liberal ones of the 1960s. And of course, ever since the early 1970s U.S. Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade, the pro-life, pro-choice debate became one of the biggest hot-button issues of the conservative revolution. And, like the early 1970s, there was a major U.S. Supreme Court case about this issue in the 1980s as well. It was Webster v. Reproductive Health Services in 1989, and the decision was made that restrictions were going to be placed on abortions, much more so than had been by Roe v. Wade. Again, this was a reflection of conservative values of the time. So, after all these lessons on the quote-unquote new revolution from 1950 to the present, we're left with one question: what does that even mean? Well, it turns out that since 1950 there have been a series of new revolutions, actually, some very liberal, some very conservative, and actually some very moderate, right in the middle of the two. In the 1950s, we had a very quiet beginning to this whole process as women were slowly trying to find ways to get into the workforce more and have more rights for themselves. People who had been censored for a long time were trying to find their voice a little more. The beatnik movement of the 1950s eventually becomes the counterculture of the 1960s, and a group we haven't even studied yet. We will in the next lesson. African Americans fighting for their civil rights in the 1950s, probably more loudly than any other revolution that was going on in the 1950s. Well, by the time we get to the 1960s, all of those quiet things from the 1950s now boil over. They basically explode into major rebellions, major revolutions, and by the time we reach the 1970s, people are tired. They really just don't seem interested in protesting anymore. And that opened the door for another new revolution to happen in the 1980s. So we have a quiet revolution in the 50s, a very liberal revolution in the 1960s and the 1970s, a period of apathy, and then a very conservative revolution in the 1980s. Where does that leave us now? Well, seems like these days things are a little bit more moderate. If you see here in this slide, George Bush is signing the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which prohibited discrimination against those with physical and mental disabilities. And that is a significant reform. Since the 1980s, we've had a number of significant reforms. But we've probably never seen the tide of revolution that took place in the 1960s, or the drastic measures stemming that tide in the 1980s. So in the end, what does this all mean? Well, it means about 4 new revolutions actually have taken place. A quiet one in the 1950s, a liberal one in the 1960s, a conservative one in the 1980s, and a pretty moderate one since then. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.